can.
Can we address one of the 5 points you mentioned?
We can.
On France and Paris. I'd like to ask an explanation about the absence of top-ranking U.S. official at the march. I know that Secretary Kerry addressed that at his press avail in India. I know also that the president and the secretary went to the French embassy on Thursday and Friday, but still Eric Holder was in Paris on Sunday. And so do you have an explanation why there was no top-ranking official in Paris?
Well, a couple points first. I think there should be no question at all among the French government or the French people that the U.S. has done anything but stand squarely by, our very close ally, our oldest ally, during and since this attack. And I think the French, actually, including the French ambassador, have been out on the record speaking about that they felt nothing but support during this. As you mentioned, Secretary Kerry spoke directly to the French people in French the day of the attacks. He and the president both went to the French embassy to sign the condolence book. And Secretary Kerry will be going there on Thursday night. As we said, he was in India for the pre-scheduled trip. If he could have been in Paris, he would have been. The ambassador, Hartley, was honored to represent the United States. But I would also underscore what the secretary said this morning, that no one event or one day represents the breadth of a relationship like we have with France. This was a very important march. We were honored to be represented there, but we have stood side by side the French. They've said so publicly since this horrific attack.
So you don't find the criticism coming from the U.S. press and also from some members of the Congress? You don't feel that this criticism are fair?
I don't feel that it's fair, and I would again let the French speak for themselves, and they have at this point, saying, they know we've stood by them, they know they've had our full support. I'll let them speak for themselves. But again, we have a very strong relationship with the French that goes beyond certainly any one day or any one event, and that will absolutely continue.
Pinpoint.
No one is disputing that. I mean, obviously, you stand by the French, and it's a very close ally, which makes it even kind of weirder that when the leaders of 50 nations were there, why there wasn't a top-level representation. I mean, we're not disputing, no one, I think, is disputing the close relationship or that the U.S. stands by France, but it just kind of just doesn't make sense. So if you could explain why.
Well, as I've said, Secretary Kerry would have liked to be there, of course. He was in India for this pre-scheduled trip. But there are more ways than just this march to show our solidarity with the French. And I think that's what I would underscore. The President of the United States going to the French embassy and signing the condolence book. The Secretary doing the same. The Secretary going to Paris later this week. This isn't the only way to show solidarity. It's certainly an important way, but it's not the only way.
Don't you think that an opportunity was missed here? I mean, you had, for example, the president of the Palestinian Authority and the Prime Minister of Israel standing within 10 feet of each other. It's about the closest you could have gotten them in years. You had world leaders at the highest level. Why not send someone of similar stature?
Well, we make decisions like this based on a variety of factors such as we've talked about security, for example. Obviously, and the White House, I'm sure, is speaking more to this right now. I think my colleague is briefing there. Obviously, for the president, there are very specific security concerns that go along when he travels. There are just a variety of factors we take into account here. And as I said, for us, this was an important march, and that's why we wanted our ambassador there. We also had folks at the march in Washington. But it is not the only way to show solidarity. And the secretary certainly would have been there if he could, and he's looking forward to going there on Thursday.
I mean, were there any discussions about, sending, if not the president, the vice president, the secretary of state, someone going, and was this debated actively within the administration?
Well, I'm not going to get into what our internal conversations look like.
I'm not asking you to characterize
was it debated inside?
Was it? It wasn't.
As we've said on the record, the secretary's schedule didn't allow it. As he said, if he could have been there, he would have been. Look, there were a variety of conversations, but I think what I'm trying to emphasize is that since this happened, we have shown solidarity with the French in so many ways that demonstrates our relationship, and that it is not defined by any one event. No matter how important the event is, it just isn't. And I understand why there's some attention being paid to it, particularly in Washington. I actually don't think there's much attention being paid to it in France, but people can correct me if I'm wrong. But what we're focused on isn't who's at a march, although important. It's how we work together to address this threat together, and that's what we're focused on.
Marie, can you speak to the timing on the announcement of Secretary Kerry's trip to Paris? Because it seems like it was tacked on after the criticism started arising about him not participating in the march.
I understand the timing seems that way. We were considering a trip to Paris. The Secretary was trying to determine if he could add it on to this trip. As you know, he does that on pretty much almost every trip he goes on. He was trying to determine if he could put it on to the end of this trip. So we were considering a trip to Paris before some of the criticism you mentioned. We announced it when we could have it confirmed and finalized. So it was in no way in response. I understand how the timing could have looked that way, but you all who've traveled with the Secretary knows he's always looking for ways to get to Paris usually under happier circumstances. But we were trying to fit this onto the trip prior to yesterday's march.
Did Assistant Secretary Newland participate in?
She was in the Washington march.
Ah,
She was in D.C. Yep, she was in
What about
Washington.
Mr. Holder? Apparently he was in Paris. Why did he not march?
I think his folks have spoken to this. His team has said it was a scheduling issue that he had to leave after his last meetings with the French government. I'll let them speak more to that, but I think that's what they've said to report.